to introduce Cedric de Koning. He is going to serve us as a moderator. He's been active in peace building for many years and works with both NUPI and Accord. I'll quickly just point out that we have Cliona Raleigh here in person from ACLED. We have Shanta Devarajan here from Georgetown, formerly the World Bank, chief economist in multiple regions, and Michael Keating here from the European Institute of Peace and formerly UN SRSG. And then we're delighted also to have Hafez Ghanem online from the Brookings, but he's dialing in, and so we will be connecting with him as well. And now I'm going to hand it straight over to Cedric. Thank you very much for doing this, Cedric. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation on looking beyond the horizon. Can conflict and political instability be anticipated and acted upon? I think this is a really interesting topic that I'm sure many of us have been grappling with. Science has this ambition to lead to theories and findings that can help us to predict the world so that we can plan better and act upon the world. But I think we've learned over time that especially when it comes to social spaces, societies, that we are dealing with highly complex environments, highly uncertain, that makes predictability very challenging. We like to talk about best practices and we like to learn from, we can lessons learned from one area and another area, but we also know that irreproducibility of particular initiatives in one space doesn't necessarily work when we carry it over to other spaces or other contexts, unless there's a lot of adaptation and localization involved, which often we don't tend to do. So I think the real interesting conversation we're going to have today is really about to what degree are we getting better at anticipation of conflicts, of crises, of instability, and what can we do with that anticipation? So if it's not about predicting, how can that improve our governance, our engagement with these spaces? We're going to kick off by, we've got this lovely panel with people who, like Leonard, who's been working on anticipation and analysis of conflict very deeply. All of the people, of course, on the panel, but we also have practitioners, people who have been acting on this knowledge in many different contexts. And so let me kick off by asking Leonard, are we getting better at anticipating conflict and crisis, both in terms of the information we're generating, and I guess leading to our further questions, information that can be acted upon?
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. Thank you, Gary, for organizing it, and of course, Cedric for moderating. So I think that we probably have come to the limit of what these models that we've developed can do, and it's not very much, and that's all right, because I think there's an awful lot here that we can understand from just kind of interpreting what's the changes that have been happening in the world at large. So I put it to a few people this morning. I said, name me a place that is currently in conflict that wasn't in conflict 2 years ago or wasn't unstable 2 years ago. And they really couldn't, right? Because there's no mysteries here about where conflict is going to happen. The mysteries may be things like, what form will it take? What opportunity will be acted upon, right? And those are things I think that the model, any model, of which there are many, struggles to interpret because they're based on the political environment of these individual countries. So when I would say to a modeler or a forecaster, what in your model tells us about the security strategy of states, which is, of course, how they're going to make decisions about whether or not to launch a missile, whether or not to try to bomb a group out of a forest, whatever the case, right? What's in the security strategy that we can actually operationalize? There's nothing, because we've decided in some ways to take what is a development policy and pretend it was security strategy and a security policy, and it's led us absolutely nowhere. Development, which is of course what we've talked about a lot in conflict research for the last 20 years, development is really important, but it has nothing to do with conflict. Nothing. Right? And if we're serious about understanding conflict and where it's going to come, we have to understand the politics and the security strategy of these states. and not necessarily the development inputs or outputs.
That's really interesting, because we just listened to the president of the World Bank and everybody else telling it's jobs, jobs, jobs. So if you say it's not development, what do you mean?
What I mean is that if you want to understand where conflict is likely to break out and what shape it will take, jobs is not going to tell you that, right? Jobs are important, but they're separate from the conflict discussion. And again, what I really want to emphasize is that we can understand an awful lot about security once we understand what are the security challenges to states and how are they going to go about dealing with those security challenges. The presumption that all states want stability or zero violence is also not true, right? States are actually fine with a certain level of violence as long as they can shape it. When they lose the ability to shape the level and the frequency and the intensity of that violence, that's when we start getting very shaky governments. But they are fine with a non-zero rate of conflict, right? Which means that the jobs need to be something that can happen even while you have an active security policy that may in fact be generating violence. That's where most states are at.
Let me move on to Shanta. Building on Cleonard's explanation and sharing of her knowledge, and I do expect, and Shanta is currently a professor of international development, but he also has a history of working with the World Bank in this area. So he's been making decisions over the last few years on these issues. And maybe if we think about anticipation as something that's not just about understanding where the next violence may break out, but understanding increasing fragility building up over time to a point where there could be a tipping point. Is it in that context where jobs and other developmental factors are part of a story that can tell you of growing fragility?
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's nice to be here. And actually, I'm delighted to see some of my former students here as well, because I teach a course on fragility, conflict, and violence at Georgetown. And so let me pick up on Cleonard's provocative statement, development has nothing to do with security. To disagree, but I think ultimately we do agree, which is both development and security are ultimately political. So, you know, what Ajay Banga didn't say today, and I think the president of Mozambique also avoided the question, is that the problems of joblessness, terrorism in Mozambique are fundamentally political problems. You've got a neglected majority in Cabo Delgado, the northern part of Mozambique, who are resentful. It's the grievance that is actually fueling the terrorism and everything else. And we have to recognize that, both for development. If you want to create jobs, you have to overcome a whole bunch of political obstacles, as well as security. But let me just then turn to the question of this panel, which is what's new or what's changed? Because I think the one thing that has changed in the last 5 years is the nature of conflict. You know, we've seen a huge increase, we saw a huge increase in intrastate conflict and a huge decrease in interstate conflict. And most of our models of trying to understand or anticipate conflict were geared towards what's going to trigger intrastate conflict. Since February 22, that's changed. We now see interstate conflicts, and after that, the events of the last 4 months in the Middle East brought that to the fore, has changed the nature of that of fragility, where countries actually invade each other or bomb each other, something that we thought had ended after World War II, are coming back. And I think it behooves us to actually start including that in our models, in our data work, in our anticipation. Not necessarily that we'll know how to predict whether a country was going to invade another country, although I think even that to most people know when they're going to do that. But more the fact that if a country is fragile to begin with and it gets invaded, that could be disastrous. And that kind of the effect of a shock of interstate conflict can be profound in that context. And what this is telling me is that some of the trends that we have noticed in conflict, and Hafez and I probably were part of the reason, which is that we were on the Middle East desk for many years, and first we realized that conflict was no longer a low-income phenomenon, that it had moved to middle income, and indeed in the Middle East and North Africa, which is a middle-income region, the entire region was fragile. But now, especially we've seen this in the last few months, is entering into high-income countries. So you've got Qatar or UAE, some of the richest countries in the world, actually facing conflict, again, because of the interstate conflict that they're in the middle of. So that would be my first plea, is let's get our models and our data together to be able to understand the prominence of interstate conflicts, because that's probably going to continue.
Thank you so much. And I guess that leads me to thinking about, okay, what information, what data, what models then do we need so that we can actually act on that information? So let me, or you can start as well, but I wanted to shift over to Michael and to Hafez because of their work in this area as well. But if you want to start off, please go ahead.
Well, the one thing I would want to say, because of my experience with these models and applying these measures, is there's type 1 and type 2 error, right? What we call false alarms and missed calls, and there's a tendency, particularly in international organizations, to avoid the false alarms. There's a real danger there, and that actually comes to another point, which is because you end up labeling a country as fragile, and that there's a lot of politics around that gets in the way. I think that's going to be even more important going forward, that we don't shy away from false alarms, as we have seen in a number of countries. And indeed, I think the other problem is that there's often contradictory information coming at you. And when I just recently did this paper called The Cost of Denial, where in countries with rapid economic growth, with deep governance problems, nevertheless, there's a tendency to overlook and in some cases deny those governance problems. And for the people in those countries, they're facing this corruption and cronyism every day. And that leads to even greater resentment of the government and indeed of international organizations who are denying it. And it reaches a boiling point and suddenly it blows up. That's what happened in Bangladesh 2 years ago, in July of 24. It also, frankly, is what really happened with the Arab Spring.
I'm glad also you pointed to Mozambique and President Chapa this morning, because I suddenly felt like an activist. I wanted to jump up and say, it's not terrorism, it's governance. It's not climate change, it's governance, about how you govern these issues. That's your major challenge. Your biggest challenge is not external. It's not climate change or external terrorism. It's internal, how you manage and how that. So maybe Hafez, if I can go over to you before I come to Michael, and building also on what Shanta just pointed out. How do you in the World Bank avoid this strong incentive to, not come up with the worst case scenario, especially if you've been, I guess, borrowing money and you're on the choice about borrowing more money or other related decisions, and you see worrying signs, but it could also be that those worrying signs are not necessarily going to lead to a specific outcome. So how can you create incentives for frankness, for risk, for putting things on the table that is politically uncomfortable?
Well, thank you very much. It's I'm happy really to be able to
We
join in
can't hear
with
you.
you.
You're not maybe muted, or is there something we need to do on our side?
I am not muted.
There we are. Now we can hear you, Hafiz. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All that you missed was my saying good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I would have preferred to be in the room with you, but this is fine also. Uh, uh, Actually, I never felt that there was an issue of lack of frankness, or even that there was an issue of not being able to uh, identify that something bad is going to happen. Listen, with Shanta, we worked in MENA. Uh, you walked. I went to Gaza for the first time, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever. It was, you don't need the PhD in economics or political science to know that the place was going to explode. The problem was not that we did not know that things were not going are going to happen. The problem was actually most of the time was to get to deal with the politics. So Gaza, example, you go and talk to the Israeli government about, okay, let us do something about the blockade. Let us try to get some goods in and goods out, and get some economic activity. The problem is that they believe that they listen to you and they say, "Oh, what you're saying makes sense," but then people believe, governments often believe that the real solution is always military. It's always by force. You see it everywhere. Mali. I had many discussions with the government of Mali about what to do in the north, and they would listen to you and say, yes, 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 thank you very much, Mr. Ghanem, this is wonderful. But back in the back of their minds, solution is always by force. The other stuff for them is fluff. So that was really, I think it is the politics and dealing with the people on the ground is always been the major problem. Our major problem was never, when I was at the bank, was never to that we were not honest with each other that this place is going to explode or that this is a problem. The second issue, which is also political, is dealing with our authorizing environment. Sometimes, I mean, we have governments sitting on the boards of the world, of the board of the World Bank, and many of those fragile situations and conflict situations are often proxy wars. I mean, this is certainly the case in Libya or Yemen and or Sudan. So, and the people fighting those proxy wars are important shareholders. And that is the limit. So I think that those are really the biggest constraints have been the politics. It is not that the staff do not know what's going on or that they're not being frank. Of course, there
Does that mean that? Does that mean that the problem is that we need a different type of information? So we've been speaking about anticipating and understanding how countries are sliding into fragility and into instability and even conflict. But what you are talking about maybe is a different type of analysis that makes us understand better the politics and political opportunities, because I guess part of the work of the bank and part of the work of many of the institutions I guess many of us are involved in is trying to shape that space, trying to influence that political space by taking certain steps, having certain incentives in place and disincentives in place, right? Is it that we lack better analysis to understand what it is we can do to influence the situation? Back to you, Hafiz.
Yeah, I think so, yes. I think you have an excellent point there, Gary. Sorry, Cedric. I think this is a very, very important point, is that I never knew how to convince the president of Mali, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita at the time, how to convince him that he needed to invest more in the north of the country. Just as an anecdote, I had a discussion with the general in Sudan, who the country was moving very nicely towards democracy and doing all kinds of reforms. And we're doing HIPEX and getting rid of their debt, and all kinds of wonderful stuff was going on in Sudan at the time with the civilian government. But then General Burhan, and everybody was telling me General Burhan is going to do a coup and get rid of the civilians. So I went to see General Burhan. I told him, General, is it true that you're going to do a coup? I said, absolutely not. Why would I do anything like that? But I mean, the arguments that we were giving him were all about general welfare of the country and the poor and all of that stuff. Was he really interested in that, or were other issues more important?
Exactly. I think that speaks to the uncertainty of the situation, right? Because you're describing Mali, where we know that, the government in Bamako was really feeling deeply ashamed, insulted in a sense by the war in the north and the loss of life and loss of dignity in a sense that they suffered, and they had a major sense of revenge. And so maybe it's sometimes these emotional, political reasons that drive decisions and not always the economics of the day, right? What makes economic sense. So I think maybe let me turn to Michael on that, because I think the first time I met you, Michael, you were the special representative of the Secretary General in Somalia. So I know you've worked in these fragile contexts very much. How would you respond to Hafez's question or challenge to say, okay, it's the politics of the day. We need to engage with the politics. You've been engaging with the politics. How have you dealt with it?
Well, thank you. And thank you for including me in this panel. I do agree with a number of points that have been made, namely that having good data and the better data, the better, is very helpful. But that doesn't necessarily lead you to taking the right decisions. I would say, in answer to your question, the most productive relationship that I had working, as it were, on the political side, whether it was in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, or indeed in Somalia, was when we got into a groove where political actors were trying to influence development strategies, and development actors were trying to influence political approaches, and that we had the relationships that allowed that exchange of information, preferably including as many local decision makers as possible, but where that wasn't possible, doing it anyway. And I think with good consequence as well. So, for example, in Somalia, one of the big things is financing and control of security forces. And there was a big effort going on to try and regularize, as it were, the security forces. And the work we did as political actors with the World Bank and the IMF to try and figure out, well, what incentives can be put in place to encourage, private security actors to become part of a more, as it were, I'm trying to think what the right word is, orthodox, security environment. And it didn't necessarily succeed, but it went quite a long way, and I never thought in my life I'd start getting into the weeds on staff monitored programs and stuff like that. And I did, because it suddenly became really important in order to create the political incentives to do the right thing on that side. And in the Middle East, for example, I happened to be there during the Second Intifada, working in the political office and having conversations with a terrific bank team on, do we understand what the construction of the barrier is going to do to both the politics and the economics and the development at a time when everybody, including the Israelis, were professing undying love for the Palestinian private sector, and that this was the answer to everything. So we thought, well, maybe we should figure out whether that's actually going to be the case. And the bank was terrific. And the lesson I take from this is that having people from the bank who are willing, I don't know, I'm not as involved in bank as I was once, who are willing to engage in these political discussions and that are incentivized and supported to do so is very important. And I got the sense, often working with a bank, that they were taking almost personal risks for doing this because they weren't absolutely sure whether they had the kind of, backup to do this stuff. But where they did, I think it was very, very productive. So I don't think it's a question of whether it's politics or development. It's how do you get the two to inform each other. One last point, just in terms of what Hafez said. I remember in a number of places saying, well, we need a political economy analysis of what's going on. And then, great thick tomes would be dumped on my desk of 280-page reports on the political economy, which just showed how all the politicians were in bed with the whatever. And, it was, and I said, well, this is great, but I can't use any of this. The issue is how do you get these issues into a domain, a political domain in which they can be discussed? So I agree with Hafez that it's not impossible, but sometimes it's quite sensitive because these political economy analyses reveal things that a lot of people don't necessarily want to be revealed. And that then comes down to the quality of your relationships with local actors and whether you can do it in a respectful way and whether you can actually form spaces and dialogues, including with development actors, that allow these things to be discussed. So it's got to be done properly.
Let me ask all of you if you can think of a particular example where anticipatory knowledge and analysis has really resulted in a good outcome, or maybe in the opposite as well. I mean, from what you were just saying, Michael, it sounds to me that when you have a very clear vision or project that people can coalesce around, then it's easier to focus the analysis, also the anticipatory knowledge on, serving that particular project. And then you have a joint, a shared undertaking, right? As opposed to the everyday trying to get development and politics to work together. But when you have a very specific vision, what you described at that particular moment, then you get people to collaborate. So maybe it's a part of the answers is how do we identify those opportunities and then really coalesce around them?
Should I respond? Well, I think there's so many of them right now. Look at the war in Sudan. The political economy. You need some political marketing to all the actors that there is a future that is much better than the present, in which they will all benefit by looking at who's supplying them the weapons, the money, but who's making the money out of it as well. So I think you're right. If you can persuade all the actors, including the international actors, that there is a project that is in all their interest to which they can subscribe and change the conversation from where we are now to a different one, then you can probably bring in all these actors in some kind of framework that gets you a bit of traction. But if you don't have that idea of marketing a political project in the first place, you're not going to get anywhere.
That's probably what the new FCV strategy is trying to do as well, is to generate that kind of project, right? Fiona?
I don't know. I think you have to squeeze them.
You probably still have to squeeze them. Yeah, too.
As in, yeah, and Sudan is a really good example where one of the groups is being squeezed at the moment. So how far can you bring it, or what support can you get to get them to realize that the end is now, right? And again, I'll come back to security strategy, which is that I totally agree that politics is obviously very, very important, but there is a security strategy that dictates who is going to be in the firing line and who is going to be effectively brought on as allies. And we completely ignore it, thinking that the politics is somehow a substitute for it. And as much as I am obsessed with the political economy and the political geography of these conflicts, I think that not understanding the security strategy of groups is really important. And the reason is something you and I have talked about before, which is that conflict at the moment is super cheap. right? It's super cheap to engage in, and it's very effective in order to achieve political ends. And so one of the things these states are contending with is how to up the price of conflict for non-state armed groups to make it not as easy to engage in it, because they are inundated by, unlike the 80s, which I would say this moment maybe is more similar to than most, but unlike the 80s, they're inundated with sometimes 10, 12 groups within the country that are challenging them in some place around, and whether they may be supported by other states or whether it's a proxy conflict, they often have several conflicts at the same time that they're contending with. And so we have to be very honest with them about the fact that some of those conflicts they're going to have to deal with militarily. So force does work, right? And they're going to have to use it often. But in other conflicts, if you can be honest with them about this is what it's going to look like in a year, and this is what it's going to look like in 2 years. And the model is pretty good, not just about the conflict rate, but about how much it's going to cost your economy, how much territory is likely going to be off limits to you in 2 years if this group starts to grow, or how many people are going to need food aid in the next 3 years if you don't handle this problem now rather than let it get larger, is the honest response to what can these models for forecasting tell you. It's not about the conflict, it's about the consequences of that conflict for these countries.
I think that's a very good point. I'm going to give you an opportunity now, Shanta, but just wanted to build on that too. I mean, if I go back to Mozambique, for instance, right, it's always I would say the opportunity for politicians to deal with the symptoms and thinking that that will solve the problem. And if our analysis can help them to understand that they're going to be still in the same position, 10 years from now, and not unleash that economic opportunity of those gas fields and so on, if they just deal with the symptoms, if they don't actually deal with the larger underlying problems, right? So it's about trying to, because for them, they're looking for the cheapest solution, also politically, which means maybe trying the security option. Right?
I think there's a missing link in what everybody's saying, which is transparency. This political economy analysis, these 280-pound reports, the problem was not just that they're 280 pages long, but they were only given to 2 or 3 people. Exactly. Right? They weren't published. They weren't disseminated to the people whose lives we were talking about. And that's the missing link. That's where we can do more at the World Bank and in other places. It is addressing the political problem that Hafez mentioned, because sometimes we do this analysis and we don't publish it because either a major shareholder or one of the governments takes offense. I think that's irresponsible, because
Also,
we have an obligation.
It also kind of shows that we have a political economy of ourselves.
That's right.
I remember I was part of a small team that did a recommendation to the Security Council. We were commissioned as a kind of independent review on the future of security support to Somalia. And essentially, I think our message was that the problem, if you want to resolve the problem, deal with those areas that are already liberated and improve governance in those areas instead of focusing on fighting Al-Shabaab. But of course, that was not a welcome message, because those who were making the decisions were benefiting from the fact that they were, and I guess most of the information and analysis were people that were steeped in the security sector.
Well, can I take that a stage further? I mean, I see there's some Afghan hands in the room as well. One of the issues that the bank preoccupied the bank was simply the cost of doing development in Afghanistan because of the security situation, which we in the political office interpreted as a sort of, well, why don't you get on with the political discussions? Because if you have successful political discussions, you can reduce the cost of security. You can imagine how well that went down, So, you can very quickly.
And isn't that the origin of the fragility concept, right? That in fragile states, it's more difficult to do development, it's more costly to do development. Hafez, do you want to come in on this conversation?
Yeah, let me come in on this last point on the costs. Yes, I mean, in those fragile situations, we have 2 types of costs. One is what you mentioned, the security cost. I mean, if I'm sending staff into Eastern DRC, for example, and I've been there. With all those security things around, it's costly. And the other issue that is very important is the fiduciary risks, where financing projects, I don't know, in South Sudan, for example, or in northern Mali, the risk of wrongdoing or the bank's money being misused is pretty high. Now, we have been finding solutions to those kinds of issues by actually using third parties. Either some big international NGOs who are better equipped than the World Bank for working in those areas, or sometimes using the UN itself. So yes, cost is an issue, but there are solutions to it. And the bank has been using different approaches to deal both with the security risk. I think the Afghanistan, I mean, I left the bank 5 years ago or whatever, so maybe they've changed. But the way the Afghanistan program was run is a very expensive way out of Dubai. But the way, for example, we were running programs in South Sudan or in or in Somalia were not as expensive.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to the audience, both online and those of you in the room, because I know there's many of you working in these areas and have a lot of knowledge in the room. So I see the panel really as a kind of a kicking off the discussion, shaping the context for the discussion. Those colleagues that are online, please chat, put your questions in the chat and they will come to us. But let's start in the room, anyone in the room, and it doesn't have to be a question. It can be, a contribution to the conversation. That's really what we would like to have. So the floor is open to anyone who would like to come into the conversation. Let's start in the front here. Gentleman in the gray suit.
Hi, my name is Paul Turner, and I work with the Fund for Peace, and we do a lot of work in human security, early warning, and response. And a lot of what you all were sharing resonates completely with our experience. I think the problem in what we've encountered hasn't been so much in finding the right data. Maybe there's not always the long enough time horizon, and I don't know that it's always issues of transparency, but it's finding a way to make the data compelling enough to catalyze political will. And that, I think, whether you're looking at kind of taking place at the community level or the national level or beyond, I think that's where we continue to hit roadblocks. And I'd just be curious to know from your collective experiences if there are other things that you haven't already raised that have helped you get over that hurdle.
Okay, let's park that for a moment. If you can go to the, Gary, over here, to the lady in the green.
Thank you, lady in the green. That's me. I'm Mareike Shamiros. I work at an institute in Kenya called Busara, and I'm very struck by these points that you made about wanting to anticipate. And of course, there's two versions of that, which I would love to hear your reflections on. Version one is, let's anticipate to see what will happen based on the data, how these trajectories could work. But then the other one is that we know that as humans, we like to also see what we want to see. And there's a thing called identity protective cognition, which makes it impossible for us to see information that becomes really challenging for us and that really maybe challenges ideas of these trajectories. And Clina, your very provocative statement saying, please do not mix security and development is such a good point, right? Because I might not agree, but I also do wonder what kicks in here in terms of the information that we really love to see, that we would love to think will work. And I just wanted to hear, particularly from those of you who've worked in these situations much more, whether you remember moments where in retrospect you think, no, I did have this information, but I couldn't see it for whatever reason it was. And what was that reason? I would love to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go to the gentleman in the white shirt and next. But I just wanted to comment on what you said, because sparked in me and a thought that I had earlier, which is maybe in our conversation up to now, we've been kind of assuming that we are the ones to make the analysis of the data. And there's this wonderful example, I think, from IGAD and the ICPAC system where they do weather forecasting for a couple of months, and then they actually go to the communities or a borderland area and engage with the key stakeholders there and present the information to them, and they are the ones who decide what to do about the information, right? So it's not something that we necessarily, as experts sitting in Washington or somewhere, can necessarily make sense of in the same way that the people who are actually affected can make sense of it. Please.
Hi, Noah Yarrow. I work in education in West Africa for the World Bank. I guess I take the role of a frustrated student. I've worked with you before, Hafez, and Shanta, I know you well, and was introduced to you today. As a frustrated student, what is the answer then? Is there a role for development, or is it completely orthogonal to security? What is the appropriate intersection, or at least a desirable intersection? It seems to run through politics, but I feel like in this conversation, I thank you for your incredible candor. I feel like we're approaching some sort of understanding, but we maybe haven't quite reached it. So I'd be interested in final words from some of the participants. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're not quite yet at final words, but we definitely, I think, need to respond to your question and the others that came up. Hafez, can we start with you? Would you like to respond to any of the questions that came up? Or
yes, please.
Comments that were made?
Yes, please. Let me start with the last question. Is there a role for development? At least from my experience, it is not broad-based development that resolves issues of conflict and fragility. But what I have seen in case after case, it is feelings of exclusion. If you have groups that are excluded, that feel that they are treated unfairly, this usually, and you add to that ethnic and religious differences, and that is usually what brings about conflict and fragility. Maybe if I can give a couple of examples, to my point would be clearer. Since we're talking about Mali, in North Mali is a different ethnic group from the rest of the country, and at the same time, North Mali they had very little government services. I mean, and I'm not just thinking about growth, jobs, and so on, but I'm thinking about simple things like the police, the justice, and so on. So there was a total vacuum. Then comes the extremists, and they fill that vacuum. So I am not saying that just having a high rates of growth of GDP growth as we measure development, that is not, or more jobs, that is not what the issue is. But the issue is how to ensure inclusion and how to avoid having groups and important ethnic groups or religious groups who feel excluded and who feel that they're treated unfairly. And you see this in country after country.
Thank you very much. I think very, very good point. It kind of makes me think that we shouldn't be at the Fragility Forum. We should be at the Resilience Forum. We should understand what prevents those countries from and what prevents those groups from building up grievances. And anyone else would like to respond to some of the questions?
I can't resist Noah's question. The thing is, you've been trying to improve education in Africa for as long as I've known you, right? That's a political problem. The reason we don't have better education in Africa, education outcomes in Africa, teachers are absent 30% of the time. 60% of the teachers of the fourth grade teachers don't have the knowledge of a fourth grader. Right? Think about that, right? Right? How do those teachers get jobs? Well, it's political patronage. So these dysfunctional institutions that are standing in the way of development, if you like, or education in this case, are also the institutions that are going to generate conflict. Because the society hasn't found a way to distribute its resources in a way that doesn't discriminate, as Hafez was saying. So this is the same problem. You've been working on conflict, although you didn't know it all this time. So I don't find any tension in this.
Isn't the problem then that we have been trying to fix the institutions, but what you're saying, it's the political choices that won't change.
That's right.
You can try and fix the institution. You can train the teachers.
Fixing institutions isn't sort of redesigning the organigram.
Yeah. So how do you influence the politics?
That's right. And then I want to come back to the first question about what kind of data, what kind of will catalyze, and maybe the lady in green from Busara had the same question. It actually is not the data; it's the analysis. I mean, I think one of the most powerful things we did when we were in MENA, and it wasn't easy, was this work on crony capitalism in Tunisia and Egypt, where we documented exactly how the links between the president and his family's holdings in the private sector led to protection of those private sector entities, which in turn undermine competitiveness and employment. So the jobs problem, and this is a message for Ajay Banga as well, the jobs problem in Tunisia was a crony capitalism problem. If you don't solve that problem, you're not going to get that. But you can imagine the first time that report was done, it was when Ben Ali was still in power. It was suppressed. We were not allowed to publish it. Right. Then finally, the revolution happened. Ben Ali got kicked out. So then we published it. And in fact, I think, coming back to the political will, there were some NGOs who criticized that, where they said, look, why didn't you give us this information back when we could have used it? Right? It would have been really useful to have some rigorous analysis behind the things we were saying. And I maybe mistakenly confessed that we did have it before, but we were not allowed to publish it. At which point they said, why should we believe you now? That means that your publications are political. That comes back to the political economy.
I'd love to pick up on some of these thoughts, both what Hafiz says and of course what you've just mentioned, which is that there is a political topography of all these countries, and their problems with conflict are sometimes based on exclusion, and they take on a very particular form. The conflict group that's going to respond to exclusion takes on a very particular form and is incentivized by very particular conditions. They are very different than the many militias that are often appearing within conflict-affected states who are not responding to exclusion. They're responding to a competition for inclusion, right? How can I get my share, right? And they require a very different solution than one that is going to prioritize development outcomes or even local engagements, right? A very different one. And so this matters because when we think about what advice can you give a country that is under kind of experiencing several threats, you have to then say, well, all right, looking at all the threats you actually experience, you're going to have several strategies in order to survive this, right? And that is just the honest assessment, and it's not going to be fair. And that's a really, really important thing. We have these extremely high burdens that we expect countries to have to get through in order to deem themselves to be kind of, well behaved, and they can't do those within this scenario. And in fact, the recent situation in Tigray is a really good example, right? The Tigray government is doing the exact same thing it did 6 years ago, which is that it's saber rattling and it's saying, if you don't come and stop this, we're going to be forced to start killing federal troops, right? And the last time they did it, people were like, well, the villain must be the national government, as opposed to these people who've just started a conflict. They're doing it the exact same thing again, expecting the same response. They're using all the words we want them to use about a legitimate cause, and they're hoping that we ignore the fact that the government has several threats on its security. It's also an incredibly important state just at the moment, and it will win another conflict against Tigray, but it will come at a massive human cost. So we know this now, right? It doesn't need to be forecast. We know it right now. What should we do? We should probably take a side, take a very public side, that if they do this, they're not going to get international support. Right? We're not going to legitimize it. Instead, they probably won't do that. This conflict will play out. It will cause hundreds of thousands more deaths. right? So the fact of the matter is that we're not acting on the information that we have, political or otherwise, because it's kind of awkward to. You do have to take a side in these conflicts. And then just to your point about earlier, about what to do once you have this information, a lot of this analysis is intelligence. It's not unbiased analysis, right? And you just have to be all right with it. I did a report for OTI, much regretted that it's gone, not that I did the report. And it was about defections in the RSF in Sudan. Who's defecting? Where are they defecting? How are they defecting? How's it going to affect the conflict? If we tried to encourage defections, you could have effectively cut the legs out of RSF in certain areas early, right? They didn't want us to say anything. They didn't even want us to imply that we'd done the report. But my point is that you can stop conflicts from taking certain shapes, whether it's northern Mali or in Darfur, but you do have to take action. You're going to have to take a side.
So I think from what you're saying, Cliona, is also making me thinking from our earlier conversation that it's not just about generating the information, it's about putting it to the decision makers in a way that show them various scenarios and the cost of the various scenarios, right? And of course, that's not necessarily, the role of ACLED or of somebody else, but then it's maybe the role of somebody in the bank or somebody in our institutions to actually take that information and put it in front of the decision makers. Because I know also from our work in developing a performance assessment system for UN peacekeeping operations is that you can generate the information about what's working and what's not working. But if there isn't a moment in the decision-making cycle of the leadership where they actually are forced to focus on that question and make decisions, they're just going to look at the information and, yes, interesting, but I can't really act on it because it doesn't give me options. Right? So there's that additional step. Did you want to comment on that or any of the questions before we go?
Just one comment, which is that, again, having political responsibilities, the approach that I found most effective, particularly when you come to a country that you don't particularly know, is to say, listen, you as local actors know your country infinitely better than anybody else. To the degree that there are solutions, you have them. No one else. You have them. But international actors and technical actors can contribute to those solutions. So put responsibility where it lies. And in some places, that's tough, actually, on local actors because they are being used and abused by external actors. But it's really important to emphasize the agency of local actors, not on politically correct grounds, but because otherwise there's never going to be any, way out of this. And I think that's very powerful because, Cliona, by the way, you should have my job. You'd be much better at my job than yeah. But in the business of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, I mean, trying to understand where people are coming from, their interests, their narratives, their sense of injustice, is as important as any amount of data. And I have to say, my experience, most productive experiences I've had, and I've often failed, is getting to know a critical mass of really well-informed local actors. And the broader the group, the better, including the people that you're not supposed to be talking to. The broader the group, the better. And that is the best basis. That's the best intelligence upon which to act. And that's the best basis upon which to embed specific, investments or whatever. Because, it's no brainer if you invest in something and you know that a particular armed group is going to fight you tooth and nail. It's just a provocation. And you don't know that unless you're talking to them.
Theoretically, what you're describing is the need for diversity in order to adapt in a very uncertain environment. Because the more information you have, more information sources, more people that can interpret what is happening, the better you are able to take that information and explore different opportunities and then respond to them, right? So I think the core of our discussion is about how do we make better judgments in the context of uncertainty? How do we move away from the idea that there can be a solution to developing information systems and management systems that enable us to continuously, iteratively adapt and learn from our experiences.
Can I just have a small note there? So about 10 years ago, right, when we had a flood of new data, and in fact, many things supported by Gary and others, we had a flood of new data, and I started experiencing from people, they would tell me that they have analysis paralysis, right? So much analysis coming in, so much data. And I agree with you, right? It's always better to have a lot of, especially local people telling you what's up. But you do at the end of the day have to say, listen, we trust this person to read this information, not as a biased interpretation, not what they want to see, but rather what they are seeing. This recent Iran war is a really good example where, you know, you could have read 20 different people, and some people were saying things you're like, oh, that's very comforting. I like to hear that. And then other people were like, I don't like saying this, but Iran is winning, right? And this is how they're winning, and this is how they're going about it, and this is what the scenario is going to look like in a month and in 2 months. And you do have to make sure that you're willing to listen to certain voices that you don't like what they're saying, but what they are telling you is the uncomfortable truth you're going to have to bear, rather than 50. Maybe you have 2 people compete with each other. One is.
And I must say that goes to answering one of the questions, which is that you were in situations in which, you know, you and what was the question that, who was it?
Misinformation because you don't want to know.
Yeah, I mean, you
Psychologically,
yes, because you have to put through a barrage of incentives and think in certain ways, and you have to try and get out from under that.
and I think that speaks to something we also touched on earlier before this meeting, is that our internal incentives in our institutions, you know, sometimes, and I think Fez and Shante also spoke about that in the World Bank context and so on, right? So how do we change the incentives also in our own institutions that will enable that kind of frankness to come up, right? To encourage people to share information, to put information on the table, even if it's uncomfortable. And that can only happen if we somehow incentivize that. If we say that's what we want, one way to do that is to say, you know, I don't want to hear how well you've implemented your program. I want to understand how you've discovered where you failed and you've made changes to it. Show me how you've adapted, right? So make that something you reward. That's a way to encourage learning and honesty, I think. Gary, do we have some questions online?
A question online. So I'm going to paraphrase it. It's from Samadara. And they asked, but what about the kind of forecasting over time in the future for the harder cases, right? Where it's easy to go to the conflict cases, right? And I think those are good provocative questions.
Say that again, it's easy to go to the conflict cases.
It's easy to talk about the conflict cases, ex post even, right? And kind of Monday morning quarterback. But we have a number of cases that are not on our list that are questions that might be on Cleona's list, but that are questions about these kind of early developments. They're on trajectories. We doubt that those are really going to work, those trajectories. And so how far out can we think about those? How do we talk about things when we're reassured everything's fine, everything's fine? That, you know, this isn't nearly as bad as the Civil War we had 20 years ago, and so you should just trust it. So how do we talk about these kind of, or the kind of Madagascar before Madagascar, the Bangladesh before Bangladesh, but even going back to Tunisia, it was only because we had the Arab Spring that was a good reason to I mean, it was only because we experienced that happened, right? So that's the online question, something to think about. These hard cases of false positives, the difficult cases that we're trying to avoid. Is this okay?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, Gary, but you actually opened the door for something. Francesca Recanatini, I'm at the World Bank, governance specialist, let's call it like that, equally frustrated. Exactly the early cases. And I think that here I want to go back to something that Afes, I had the privilege, this is a fantastic panel, and I'm going to put on the table something that might be provocative exactly because you all guys have opened the door. Conflict and instability to me is related to misallocation of resources. And I think that if we go back to the question that you have, and unequal opportunity. So you're thinking about how to have early warning for cases, but you keep gravitating to country that all of us that are working in this environment know that sooner or later will explode. Tunisia was more surprising, right? When it did happen, and I was there. So what about the middle income, high income country that at the beginning of this panel that we were pointing out, and now these are coming up. There, the issue is more, can we actually look at data and use the data, not just look in the data and do the analysis, actually use the analysis to identify some element, dimension that can tell us this country is on a path to, and really tension within the country. And I have a few high-income country that I think that they are going down that path. Shanta is laughing, but because we have worked together, so he knows where I'm going. And so I think that this is the first part of the question that I think that is very important. What do we do? And if we actually think about that, and here is a note, why we are now talking more openly of the link between governance and corruption and fragility. This is a note for the organizer. There is not a single session in the whole Fragility Forum on the link between corruption, misallocation of resources, patronage, nepotism, whatever you want to call it, and conflict. And I think that this is something that shows how we are not willing to tackle the hard question.
I think both the online question and this question is so good. Is your question on the same issue? Let's just stick to this for a moment, because I think it's a really important question, because it speaks to the heart of, anticipatory knowledge. So, I mean, if it talks about, and I think in my mind, two countries that I've recently engaged with, Malawi and Zambia, for instance, right? They are not conflict-affected countries, but they are countries where we see increasing tensions building up. And the World Bank is there, the UN is there, all the actors are there. So we are seeing this, we are acting. Are we acting in a way that we think is the problem and the solution? Is that maybe the problem? That yes, we are seeing things, we are acting, but we are maybe misunderstanding, or our solutions are not working? That's the other question. Not just are we acting, but are we acting in a way that would actually prevent this trajectory from ending in further fragility and conflict? But please respond to the broader question, and then if you want to
Malawi
as well.
Malawi. I think Malawi is going to be all right. But it's actually a really good question, right? Because there's a spectrum of political disorder. And as I mentioned earlier, countries can have representation from several parts of the spectrum simultaneously. And equally, there's a presumption that they can move up that spectrum, very rarely down that spectrum, but they do, right? So in non-conflict states, like the US is a really good example, right? Let's start there. So there is a presumption that high rates, especially in high-income states, high rates of polarization are the bedrock for instability, right? No, it's not really. But what it is that you can have high rates of polarization, just like you can have high rates of underdevelopment without conflict. Malawi is a great example, right? So you can have high rates of polarization, which we have in all Western states at the moment, right? The reason that the US has a particular type of conflict signature is because it has a very high rate of gun ownership. It has a very high rate of opportunity, right? For individuals and for groups. But if you were to expect a non-conflict state to develop violence, you don't look at some of these structural features, right? What you would look at is, am I seeing a convergence of interests that are increasingly starting to mobilize around something that is anti-government, right? This is what I used to say in the election last year. I said, there's no way that election is going to be violent. Absolutely none. And the reason is that there's no sign of mobilization for an anti-state group, or even kind of an anti-civilian group that is coordinated enough. You had these things called active clubs, do you remember? Right? It's just a few guys in a gym, right? They weren't that serious, but there were many of them and they freaked everybody out. So you have to be able to stand back and say, am I seeing the signs of a coordinated, comprehensive attempt to form an armed group, right? And then once you get there, then things open up quite a bit, right? The possibilities. But don't presume just because your society has become a bit disorderly. I mean, I live in Britain at the moment, right? I myself might take a crack at the prime ministership at this stage, right? It's like there's just a lot of disorder, right? Yeah. But my point being here is that we shouldn't mistake kind of uncomfortable political moments for those that are actually going to lead to violence, right? At the same time, we shouldn't blind ourselves to what does lead to violence.
That's really interesting, Cleonard, because I feel that if you're at the point where you can identify serious mobilization, you far down the problem, right? I'm more worried about earlier on tensions building up, social cohesion breaking down, public trust breaking down. Those are also public bads that we are not only interested in violent conflict, we are also interested in instability, fragility growing from growing inequality and various other forms of social tensions. So I think we also want to act on those, not just on violence. But Shanta?
Yeah, I would say that you need to look at unconventional indicators, not the usual suspects. And I think the example of Tunisia before the Arab Spring is impressive because they had high growth. Tunisia had falling inequality in the first decade of the 21st century. In fact, the IMF had a conference in October 2010 labeled Tunisia a model country. By November 2010, that guy burnt himself up in the Arab Spring spread. But there's one indicator that we don't normally look at, which was the happiness indicator from the Gallup poll that showed it actually, it was the lowest in the world. And it was declining during that same period. That's the kind of indicator we should be keeping track of alongside our usual conventional indicators. Now, the second point is, that explains why the unhappiness was so high, is in our zeal to measure extreme poverty and the decline in extreme poverty, we risk forgetting about the middle class. And that was what was going on in Tunisia. But the other more recent example is Bangladesh. I mean, I celebrated, Bangladesh having better poverty indicators than India and, better health and education and all this growth. And it had a garment industry that was very successful. But the problem was when the people who left the $3 a day poverty became middle class and they had higher education levels, they aspired to white collar jobs, particularly government jobs. And then when there was a restriction on the access to government jobs, a revolution took off. So we can't be relying on our usual indicators and patting ourselves on the back every time we make progress on those, because there are all of these other danger signs lurking below.
So again, a much greater diversity of information to make our assessment. Hafez, do you want to come in on this point?
Yes, I want to come in on a couple of points, if I may. First, on this point of, okay, if I can project, if I see like a middle income country or even a high income country has a high risk of going into fragility and conflict, what can I do about it? I don't think that we can publish, the World Bank can publish a paper saying country X has a high risk of fragility and conflict. That would be like calling for conflict or whatever. But you need to do two things, in my view. One is readjust your whole program to deal with what you consider are the drivers of this conflict. And the second thing, which actually many of us are able to do, is to go and talk to that country's leadership in private, not in public, about what you are seeing and sharing the data and information with them. I think that this is a very, very important point, because we need, if we have data, if we have information that something is going to happen, we need to find a way of using it. And just publishing it like that, I mean, it's like Shanta's report on crony capitalism. It won't work.
Is there a middle way where you can do the report, but like the ICRC would do, for instance, you share it with the country, you share it with also the leadership in the bank. So the information is out there in the space. People can't ignore it, but it's not public. Is that something you?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I meant. Is that you share it with the leadership of the country, with the leadership of the bank. So we have this information. We have this dialogue with them. But it would be very difficult to go public. If you're able to go public, that's even better. I mean, I know Shanta will say you need to be very transparent and all of that. Second point I wanted to make, which is when we talk about conflict and the point on governance and corruption, it is true that, at least in my experience, there's a high correlation between the two, between corruption and conflict. But I'm not sure what causes what. I mean, at least in my experience working in many African countries, where you have many ethnic groups, where the sense of nationhood is not yet fully there. You actually the government often actually uses corruption or patronage or rent allocation to keep different groups happy. And then conflict often happens if one group feels that they're not getting enough. Look at the example of Côte d'Ivoire in the 1980s, where Houphouët-Boigny just kept it by together by sharing the money from the cocoa exports around. But then Houphouët died. His successor did not do that, and there was civil war. So this is another point, which is I don't know. I mean, the solution is really is how to build a sense of nationhood, how to build the right institutions for sharing wealth, rather than what we often see in some of those countries. My very last point is on Cleanne's point when you said that we need to pick sides. So Tigray example. So I'll pick the side. I'll be against Tigray. I love Abiy Ahmed, and I think he's a great guy, and those Tigrayans are upsetting him. So I'll be against Tigray. But then the problem is somebody else will be for Tigray. And that is what we see happening, is all of those proxy wars. So, how do you avoid that?
Do you want to respond to that?
I will, because actually you're totally right. The second that somebody comes out and says, listen, TPLF, we know what you're up to, and we won't come in and save you after this is all over, then I would imagine that you have potentially all sorts of parties, but most worryingly, I think Russia or China taking a position as pro-Tigray. I don't think Tigray's a bad bet, so I'm not sure either of them would take it, to be honest. But what I mean, I suppose, is to say that what we're going to see, and I'm curious about whether you agree with this, Hafez, what we're going to see in the next 10 years is that a lot of middle powers are going to start really pushing the geopolitical envelope a bit, and there will be territorial change, not just in the Horn, but elsewhere, right? Everybody is on maneuvers because now's the moment. There's very little international oversight. There's a lot to be gained from this moment of change. It will be highly conflictual. And what we'll have afterwards is a new set of powers that have come out of this, probably pretty bloodied, but they'll come out of it. And it's whether or not you can work with those parties. So I think that maybe you need to make a few long-term bets on who you think is going to come out of this and what you think that environment is going to look like afterwards. Even if you don't have to love Abiy Ahmed, right? Made some mistakes, no one can deny it. But we might have to stand behind people that we think are going to be here in 10 years, looking after a country of 120 million.
And I think building on that, the point you made earlier, that sending a signal to a certain party or state that, we are not going to be able to invest in infrastructure or X, A, B, and C if that's going to be destroyed in the next year or two. So if we see you moving in that direction, we're going to have to change our portfolio. We had a question there, and then there's a question online. So let's. Okay, do that.
A question online. How do we actually operate under deep uncertainty? And how do we ensure that institutions can possess the legal, the financial, and the political agility to be able to maneuver accordingly? So that's a question online.
Thank you very much. And I want to say that we're in our last 10, 12 minutes. So don't be the person who walks out and say, I wish I asked that question. Ask it now before the moment has passed.
Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Anna Tami. I also work in education, but in a past life, I worked on governance and specifically preventing election violence. And I was in a country where there were lots of these very tricky political economy analyses done, didn't always reach the government. And, you know, there's a risk, right? There are trade-offs. International staff can get thrown out of the country if you talk too much or too forcefully about these issues with government. At the same time, there are real risks for your local partners in civil society to be raising these issues. They're there. They actually, they're at physical risk. So I guess my question to you is, how do you work on expanding these kinds of spaces where these local voices really can come out? And so that these grievances can be expressed and addressed before they actually turn into conflicts. So thank you. And if you have any experiences to share from countries, that's great.
Thanks so much. We're going to take a number of questions now. So I want to ask the panel to take notes and to choose some of them. We're not going to ask everybody to expand to respond to everything.
Thank you, Cedric. Marcus Lenzen from the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund, not the Fund for Peace, but not to be mistaken. Sort of two questions. You spoke earlier in some of the answers about the extent to which I think it was Hafez about, in your experience, ultimately we need to again look at inequalities, right? And that if you want to get it right, you have to focus on that. And of course, that makes me think back to Pathways for Peace, right? And interestingly, at the UN, we still talk a lot about that report, right? And it's interesting now at the bank with all this focus of jobs that you think back to Pathways for Peace, it's three major things: inequalities, especially horizontal, jobs, and justice, right? And now in this big push for jobs, we don't hear so much about the other two. At the same time, my short question is, in your experience of analyzing, especially I'm looking at ClearNet, but certainly at others, but from sort of ACLED experience, to what extent have you actually seen, especially horizontal inequalities, as being a major predictor of? Okay, so there we go. See, which is interesting, right? If we're looking at, okay, where are we focusing then on in terms of the efforts? And the other thing, I guess, in this context, especially with the outlook you just gave us in the medium term for history, which is a lot more conflict, expect a lot more of that and see where the dust settles, right? And the bets you need to make. In a context where everything has become so much more transactional, and sort of also understanding why are they making these bets now in terms of the action? Because, well, okay, the transaction costs are lowered and we can maybe gain from this, right? But at the same time, I also hear a lot of middle powers sort of say, but actually we're very worried about this. And as much as certain big powers are saying, I don't care about multilateral solutions, I'm going to go my own transactions and deals and all that, say, we're worried about this because we know this is going to come back to bite us in so many ways. And we're actually doing a lot to counter that, to try to convince them in the long term, this is not going to be in your interest to do so, right? But like that argument, which is both a moral one, but also one that says to say, I'm going to show you this, how it can be interesting to find what we would call a multilateral solution, not one where you fight about it and hope you win. Do we have a prospect of moving to that direction? Scenario building. You say no. I wonder what the others say.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Pranav. I'm a recent student in Professor Shanta's FCV class, and I'm an international lawyer. I have two comments. First, one of the core themes of the panel, I think, has been knowledge. The production of knowledge, whether it should be publicized or privately taken, and then what to do with that knowledge, dissemination to communities. My sense is that there is a tendency in developmental actors to overvalue financing over knowledge, even though knowledge may be a cheaper way to do development in fragile contexts. And there is a tendency towards centralization over localization. And this goes to my second comment, which is an example from an adjacent field where anticipatory warnings have somewhat made their way to anticipatory action, is in disaster prevention and disaster response. A specific example I have been studying recently is FAO's Swalim program in Somalia, Somalia water and land information management, where there were triggers for anticipatory for information and early action, and robust systems of making sure that information is trusted, is understood, and leads to community action. For example, through leveraging tech, messages through a system called Diginine, where directly to the communities in villages, people got messages on their phones that we have reached this trigger point and you should be taking this action at this point, or loudspeakers in community common spaces. So I think there is a spectrum of technocratic options below the level of political maneuvering, which can help in fragile contexts as well. And I wonder what thoughts the panel may have on that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I think a question or two on this side.
Thank you. My name is Georgia Harley. I'm the lead operations officer for IDA here at the World Bank. You may be aware that the new FCV strategy emphasizes how we can anticipate better. And Ajay even mentioned this morning this new Hoover Institute that now has an acronym that will, with the invisible hand of AI, guide us toward better forecasting and indicating countries at risk. And with the benefit that I think that none of you are currently in the employ of either of the World Bank or the Hoover Institute, I am interested if you have any insight or perspective on that type of an index, pros, cons, flaws, pitfalls, ways in which it can be used. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think there was one more question, Gary. Did you want to? The lady. Oh, you can go first and then the lady.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I'm Henry from Burkina Faso. I'm leading a youth-led organization engaged in peace building, health, and education. I got to be invited by Professor de Koning on a webinar on the Lac-Tchad basin on climate security. So I'm glad to meet you again here. What I want to emphasize is the situation of Burkina Faso in link to the theme of this panel. I've been talking of political instability and conflict and how the anticipation can prevent conflict and political instability. The case of Burkina Faso is linked to many factors, like the lack of education for many people, poverty, so the lack of employment opportunities, but also a powerful religious factor. You know, for many decades, many people, they go to like Northern Africa to be trained as Muslim leaders, muftis. But for a few decades, now they go to the Middle East, mainly Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And when they come back home, so they refuse what the other leaders they used to authorize. Like they say, you cannot wish Merry Christmas to your neighbor. And they think this is haram. So you cannot eat the food of the Christian. So you cannot go to their house. You cannot give them like your daughter for marriage. And so many things. So this is things that bring divides in our society. And now the government, so the government is getting aware of that. And recently, the government is on the way to adopt a law on religious liberty. Unfortunately, many Muslim people don't want it because they think that they will prevent them, you know, to continue to pray everywhere they want.
Unfortunately, we're a bit short of time, so please wrap up. Huh?
Yeah, so these are some factors of instability and conflict that I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for one last question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this panel. I'm Vidya. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins currently. My question was in relation to what Mr. Hafiz mentioned. This, when it comes to conflict or conflict-ridden states, is it a political will, be existing economic structures, like whatever that might be, and or the lack of nationhood that makes third world, second world country is ridden with conflict, so much more long drawn than countries in the first world, which sort of were resolved by through other avenues such as mediation, and why that doesn't work as well in second or third world countries ridden with conflict.
Thank you so much, panel. We have a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask you for like a 1 minute type of answer for something you would like to respond to as well, including your final message that you would like to give the panel, to the colleagues in the room and online too. I'll start with you, Michael, then Hafez, then Shanta, then Cleonard.
What a great crop of questions. I mean, my mic does not seem to be working. I do think a lot of conflicts in developing countries are still being resolved at a local level, actually. And I think it would be it's interesting your question, but I think it would be a mischaracterization to say that somehow they are being resolved through mediation and dialogue in richer and more sophisticated countries and aren't elsewhere. I mean, it's quite a broad brush that. On the issue of responsibility, knowledge, and what do you do with it? And I'm linking this to another comment about corruption. I mean, in Afghanistan, the Afghans were into low-level corruption until NATO showed up, at which point corruption was turbocharged. And, you know, pointing that out also got you into a lot of trouble. So, you know, and I'm not sure that the bank ever wanted to go there. And yet lots of stuff on local corruption, just silence on the degree to which that was being incentivized and magnified by the governors of the World Bank. Is that the right word for them? The countries they're in. The Swalin example I love, but I think it's got to be both the political and the sub-political. And I had the fortune to be in Somalia in 2016 when a lot of people were predicting a massive famine with huge socioeconomic and political and conflict consequences. And I think, just because we have to be brief, we basically stopped it by mobilizing political and financial action, both by the Somalis and by the international community, and got development actors on board. We stopped it, and no one knows about it as a result, because it didn't happen. You know, I could carry on, but I want to stop you at that positive note before we go into a negative note, because that's a lovely contribution. Hafez.
No, thank you very much. I'll make one point actually, and it's on a positive note, because somebody raised the issue of listening to everybody and can we get different people in the room and talk to them so that we can understand what's going on and try to find solutions, whether at the local level or at the national level. And I think that institutions like the World Bank, the United Nations, or even some of the regional development banks like African Development Bank have this capacity, this convening power, and that actually it should be used more. It should be used more, bringing together people from different religions, different ethnic groups, and sitting and discussing. It is good for people to listen to each other, but it's also good for the bank and others to better understand what is driving the conflicts and the fragility. So
thank you so much, Hafez. Shanta.
I want to take the question on inequality, horizontal inequality, because in fact the statistical relationship between horizontal inequality and conflict is very, very weak. It's almost zero. And you can see why, because it's not just the simple Gini coefficient that matters, it's whose incomes are falling. And that you often find that it's the slightly wealthier group who lose as a result of some government policy that then leads to a conflict. And my own country, Sri Lanka, and I am a Sri Lankan Tamil, is an example of that, where the minority was better off. There was a move to reduce their access to education and jobs and so on, and they tried to secede. and went into a 26-year civil war, where you had a decrease in inequality and an increase in conflict. And then on the question of the persistence of conflict, I think that was your question, right? Why is there this persistence of conflict? And I think that is similar to what we've all been talking about, which is if you believe that conflict is a reflection of an underlying dysfunction, institutional dysfunction, you don't solve that with a peace agreement or even or a ceasefire. And that's what's been happening. We sign a peace agreement, everybody celebrates, pats themselves on the back, go back home, and then 6 months later, the war started again. And so until you do the hard work of trying to fix those institutional dysfunctions, you're not going to get out of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anta. Clear.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to wrap up the comment kind of to address all. So I started by saying that there's a non-zero rate of violence, and that I want to bring it back to the forecasting models. Countries experience a very wide range of violence concurrently in one territory, their state, right? It is very difficult for a forecasting model to tell you why the conflict in the north is different than the one in the south, why the conflict in the city doesn't look like the conflict in the northwest. They're different conflicts. They have very different things that are stimulating them and that they're evolving into. So you might end the civil war in the middle, and many of those actors might decide to migrate up to the north in order to perpetuate the same type of violence in a different setting. So my point here is that there's no one cause, right? There's no one solution by any stretch of the imagination. There is a rich tapestry of problems, right, that they're responding to at all times. And some of those political environments incentivize particular types of conflict to emerge, and some support others. So to Hafez's point about exclusion was very important for the generation of civil wars, particularly in the 1980s. African states in particular took on a widely inclusive governance agenda in the 1990s and 2000s, and now are some of the most inclusive in the world. They still have problems. The conflict evolved and adapted to the political circumstances. It doesn't go away.
Thank you so much. We're basically out of time, so maybe just one very short wrap-up comment from me. We started this session by talking about how to improve our judgment and our anticipatory analysis in the context of uncertainty. And I would just say in the context of uncertainty, we know that we can't be through AI or any other means, find predetermined solutions that work in every case. We're not going to find a correlation between inequality and conflict across the board. But inequality may be a very important, or grievance driven by inequality may be an important factor in a particular context. So we have to be context specific. We have to be participatory. We shouldn't try to solve the problems just on our own, but together with the people affected by the conflict. And we have to learn from experience, right? If there's no overall solution that we can apply everywhere, then we have to discover those solutions ourselves in collaboration with the people in an iterative, adaptive way all the time. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing this hour and a half with us. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Fragility Forum.
Thank you very much to our panel, and thank you to Hafez for joining us. It's late where you're at. Appreciate it. We do need to clear this room quickly because the next session will come in. And so if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can do it in the hallways, you can do it down in the atrium, you can go somewhere else, but you can't do it here.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much. Yeah. Thanks so much. Martin.